Recording as well. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining for this final LAMSIG webinar of 2025. We're very excited today to have with us Ian Collins from Yashar University. Hope I said that correctly.
Very well pronounced, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. It was all that training you gave me earlier. So in this webinar, we're going to be talking about strategic planning and how to form action plans to help support continuous improvement in language programs. If you've got any questions that you'd like to ask, please feel free to type them in the chat box, and then we'll deal with them towards the end of the session. All right, over to you, Ian.
Thanks very much, Johnny. Welcome, everyone. Nice to see everyone. So let me just share my screen so I can fire up my PowerPoint, and then we'll get going. So hopefully everyone can see that. So we're here to talk about strategic planning and review in language programs, some practical considerations. And I should say this is a huge topic, and I can only really scrape the surface of it. And I'm going to give some very sort of broad brush sort of principles to start with. And hopefully, if we get through in time, we'll do some exercises together. So let's fingers crossed on that one. So let's sort of go through. I wanted to start with a couple of little quotes here. The first one I think is sort of quite funny. I mean, I think a lot of us just hope for the best when it comes to planning and review. But as we'll see, it's usually not the best way forward. And then a second quote here, although this relates to educational change generally and is from an article that's very old now. It amused me to see how this was described, and in particular, the title of the article, "The Light Feeling of Chaos," I think sums up exactly how many of us feel about planning. And so what I want to do tonight is hopefully demystify it to some extent and convince you that most of the time it's just a question of being systematic and working very hard, and then you will get the outcomes that you're desiring. Okay, so our agenda for tonight will define a few key terms. I'm going to look at some of the key elements of a strategic plan and how they relate specifically to quality assurance. I will show you some example planning documents. I've been working with an accreditation agency in Turkey for the last year on their strategic plan, and they've given me permission to share some of the documents with you. So I'll put those on the screen. I'm not going to actually send them to you, but if you would like a copy, most of them are public documents, so you can just let me know and I will send you a copy. And then hopefully, if we do have enough time, we'll try and have a go at putting together a very, very basic plan so that you can get some of the ideas in practice. So to start with, I thought we might start with just some learning outcomes. And if you don't need to call out or write in the box, but just have a look, see if you can fill in the gaps there for our learning outcomes. I'll just give you 30 seconds or so for that. You can shout out if you want to, but you don't need to. So let me give you a few more seconds. And okay, so here's the answers there. So we're going to be defining what is meant by strategic planning and how it relates to quality assurance, and identify the necessary components of an effective strategic review plan, and analyze examples of strategic planning documents, evaluate their efficacy. We're going to do that in a very sort of surface way, but hopefully you'll get the message. And then lastly, as I said, if we get the time, we'll try and construct a strategic plan process. So I just had a message from Özlem that you can see. Let me just display duplicates. So yeah, that's maybe better. Is that better for everyone? Yeah. Okay, that's good. Okay, so I do a lot of work with a US accrediting agency. They accredit more than 330 programs worldwide, and I very often go on site visits. Now, about 50% of those sites, when they first come up for accreditation, do not meet the planning standards. And it's always a bit of a mystery because we always feel, well, they're really not that difficult to meet. So what is it that prompts them to have so much difficulty doing it? And so I've thought about this quite a lot, and this is one of the reasons I'm here tonight. But here are some of my observations from what I see when I'm accrediting different programs. So, I mean, one of them is just they don't have a written plan at all. Effectively, they're not really doing any strategic planning. Um, Often there is a plan, but it just simply isn't strategic. It's just basically a kind of to-do list, and we'll talk about why that might be problematic a little bit later. Um, and linked to that, this to-do list really is effectively a wish list. And it's a wish list because it doesn't have clear, measurable objectives and action steps to actually achieve what you want to achieve. And if I had to sort of name one reason why planning usually goes awry, probably this is the biggest one, that you're not quite sure what you want to achieve, and you have no real clear plan as to how you're going to do anything. And linked to this, sometimes there are plans, sometimes they have fairly good objectives, but decisions are just being made, and it's often a small cadre of people who are just making them, and they're not basing that on really any evidence. And once they make the change, they then don't evaluate the outcomes of that change. And so things, again, tend to go a little bit awry if you're not doing that. And the last reason I see often, or quite relatively often, they've got a fairly good plan, a vision, and defined outcomes, but for whatever reason, they're just not implementing it. That often comes from people moving, changing jobs, people not having the experience to actually work their way through it, just staff turnover generally, or just a pure resource problem. They just don't have the time to do it. So those are my observations, and that sort of prompted me to try and do this session. So to help those people who haven't got much experience doing these kinds of things, see if you can get some just basic steps to push the needle along. Okay, so let's start with a couple of sort of key words. Again, I won't get you to sort of shout out or write in the chat box. You're more than welcome to if you want, but I want to sort of get through this early stuff a little bit quicker to give us more time to do some actual practice a little bit later. So firstly, what is a vision? And then secondly, what actually is a strategy? And you'll be amazed at how many times I ask this question, and particularly the word strategy gives people a great deal of difficulty. So let's have a look at vision. So this is my definition of what a vision is, and in a minute I'll show you an example of a vision statement. So really, it's simply, where an organization is going and what it's going to look like when it gets there. Some people sort of moan about visions and say, oh, what a load of woke nonsense. But I strongly believe that, you're never going to achieve anything good unless you really have a clear idea of where you want to go. Now, this could be at organizational level, and I'm going to show you in a minute a document that I've been working on with this accrediting agency. Or it might be something just part of your program or something in your program. But unless you've got a fairly clear idea of what you want it to look like after you've done your planning, then almost certainly you're not going to get there. And then in strategy, the definition of strategy, I like to keep it simple. It's simply a plan of action designed to achieve a long-term or overall aim. And now, of course, these things go together. You're going to start with your vision. Where do you want to go? And then you're going to be thinking, so how do we actually get there? How do we achieve this long-term or overall aim? And I do notice when I'm on site, sometimes the strategy is not actually a strategy. It's simply back to that to-do list. It's just simply a list of weekly tasks. That isn't what I would consider a strategy to be. A strategy is something where you have an organizational goal that you've defined and you've got a way of getting there. It's not just meeting sort of daily or weekly tasks. Okay, let me just give you an example. So DEDAC is a Turkish accrediting agency. I work with a US accrediting agency, and I also work with the Turkish one. DEDAC is a very new organization, and until 2025 did not have any kind of planning documents or strategic review capabilities. So we've been working with them pretty much from a zero or a blank piece of paper, which actually has been useful because it means we could start off in the right way. So we did a lot of brainstorming, a lot of kind of focus groups and things to get to this vision document. And in effect, it's basically us saying, well, in the medium to long term, so we're talking sort of between 3 to say 7, 8, 9, 10 years, what would the success of DEDAC, what would the accreditation look like? And you can see here we've got this is an extract. There's slightly more bullet points than this, but there are 5 bullet points there, and you can see there's certain key things that we want to make sure that we achieve over that period of time. The second bullet point, for example, financial stability is extremely important to the agency. It can only continue operations if it gets some kind of financial stability. And so that was a key goal and something that was very difficult to work out objectives for, but something that was very important. The other things all pretty much as important, but maybe a little bit easier to achieve. For example, the penultimate bullet point there, we need a pool of well-trained and good quality reviewers that can actually meet the demand for accreditation, which is growing exponentially in Turkey. And it takes quite a while to train these people. And many people are not that open to doing this kind of work. It's completely unpaid, but it's 6 or 7 weeks of quite intense work, and the site visits are quite difficult. And so it's not always easy to get good quality people to join. So one of our targets was that. So this is my example of kind of a vision document where we sat down. We spent a long time over this because we really wanted to define the kinds of things we wanted to do. Okay, let's move on then. So the other thing I wanted to point out, and another thing that I notice when I'm on sites and they're showing me their planning documents, very often they're simply review plans. They're just looking back at how things have gone, usually over the academic year. Now, of course, that's absolutely vital and something that we would expect to see in a planning document. But what they often lack is the strategic element of a document. So the looking forward bit. And that's where, it links to the vision or the overall mission of the program or the institution. Now, how are we going to achieve this mission? So for my own institution, for example, we're in an EMI environment. We're in the preparatory class. We're training students to study in English in their departments. They come to us often with very, very low levels of English, and we've got 8 months to get them to a level when they can actually study in the subject of their choice. Some might say that was mission impossible. It probably is, but it definitely needs a plan of how we're going to do that. It's not a question of just opening the course book and saying let's go to page 1. It just doesn't work like that. So we've spent a lot of time in working out, well, how can we actually achieve this objective? Of course, we have plans looking back at how we're doing, but it's just as important to look forward. So in your own mind, when you're putting these plans together, you really need to be thinking about what's the strategic element and what's the review element. Okay, and the other thing I wanted to do, because again, people seem to sort of miss this, you get bogged down with the day-to-day minutiae of planning, and you sort of forget sometimes why you're doing it. So I wanted to draw a very clear link with the quality cycle. And the quality cycle, I think, more and more in education and language teaching has become sort of better appreciated and better known by just general teachers. And so, looking forward, looking back as our strategic plan, that is effectively putting the quality cycle into practice. And I've got just a graphic here. Hopefully you can see that. So on the left there, we've got, the quality cycle. I'm sure, maybe the words are slightly different, but everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with that. And then on the right, I've got the kinds of things that you would see in an average plan. And you can map fairly easily the parts of the plan onto the quality cycle. So in effect, the plan is the quality cycle. They go together. The plan is simply a tool for achieving everything that you want to achieve in the quality cycle. Okay, and then just another graphic here that's setting out for you the kinds of steps that you would do in a typical plan. So obviously you're going to start with the preparation. For me, and when we were working on the DEDAC, the accreditation agency plan this year, the first thing we did was do a lot of focus groups on, what we want the accreditation agency to be and how we can do it. So that's in this kind of orange rectangle there. And we spent a lot of time identifying some of the environmental challenges. There were both sort of economic challenges, political challenges, and many things that would stop us achieving that. So we spent a lot of time identifying those. And then we went through the design stage, and I'm going to show you the kinds of documents that we looked at in doing that. Basically the kind of the plan of the plan, I suppose you could call it. And that's where, from that document, we got the vision, and then we started creating these specific plans. And I will show you some examples of those. And we are dipping our toes right now in the execution stage, actually doing some of the plans. Now, there are many kind of change models. I'm sure many of you are much more familiar than me about some of these. I've looked at loads and loads of them. They're basically all the same, I would say. I mean, people have preferences for some over others, but they're all following a fairly simple cycle, which is basically this, but just in miniature. So you'll prepare, you'll design, you'll execute, and you'll sustain by reviewing what you've done and measuring its success. So, feel free to use a change model. At the moment for the DEDAC accreditation agency, we're not using a specific model because the plans are relatively simple. They're not easy necessarily to do, but they're not complicated to envisage or to think about. And then the last part, and this is one of the sort of key parts, and I think possibly one of the most challenging, it's the actually sustaining what you're doing. And that's both sustaining the implementation of the specific plans for that year or whatever period you've done it for, but then the overall process sustaining that as well. And I've put build consensus in the last box there. That's one of the things that, to be successful, you're going to have to build consensus. If your organization is anything more than sort of 10 people, you're going to need people to buy in, because it always creates a bit of extra work. We'll talk about that in a second. So that's our model for strategic planning. I presume that these slides will be made available to anyone, but if not, then feel free to email me at the end and I can send you the slides. Okay, so let's move on to talk about strategic planning versus firefighting. And if you remember at the top of the presentation, I was talking a little bit about how when I go onto sites, often I just see basic to-do lists rather than plans, even though they're called strategic plans. And, this is something that is inevitable. We have to fight fires. There's no way of avoiding that. We're made aware of an issue. We have to solve it, often very quickly. That's fine. Just don't confuse that with strategic planning and review. Strategic planning and review is about using a systematic approach, using data, planning how you're going to achieve something, and then reviewing and evaluating what you've done. It's the kind of polar opposite, really, of firefighting. And both are necessary, of course, just don't confuse the two. Okay, let's move on to the challenges. And I'm sure all of you will be very familiar with most of these challenges since they are um, actually challenges that we see in teaching generally. So, first of all, I've already mentioned sustainability. That's something that is the enemy, I think, of strategic planning. People leave, the director goes to another job, someone's promoted into that position who's never done any of this kind of thing before, wasn't involved in the original plan, and things tend to then slip. Um, Priorities change, economics come into this. If you're in a language school, some kind of institution, you might suddenly change your way of targeting students, for example. The types of students you want might change. If you're at a university, the university administration or senior management may want you to focus on something different. And so you might have perfect plans, but priorities change. And so things just don't happen. And then, of course, you're going to have the odd crisis from time to time. Um, we've talked about reviewing and looking back and looking forward, so I won't mention that again. The third bullet point there, expertise. Now, I don't mean necessarily people with, formal qualifications in planning or that kind of thing. I'm talking about just someone who has a basic grasp of how to put together a plan and how to implement it. And, most of us, I presume, started as teachers and probably got promoted because we were quite good teachers into some form of administrative role, which is great and inevitable, but usually doesn't actually mean we're qualified to do an administrative job. Now, some of you probably are very lucky and have had some formal education or you've done a lot of self-training to get that expertise. But I'm sure there are probably holes, and I count myself in that too. And so, there's often a gap, particularly in the planning areas, I think, and this is one of the reasons when I'm on doing reviews of sites, when I look around, I can see people, they're very well-meaning and want to work hard. They're just not quite sure of how to do it, and there's no one there really leading them. The next bullet point about authority, I think this is also something that can be very difficult, particularly in very flat structures. Planning requires people effectively sort of forcing other people to do stuff they don't want. That may sound very sort of illiberal, but I think is the reality. There are many things that you need to do which are not very pleasant. They're almost always in addition to someone's day job, and therefore, they don't want to do it. So you need to have some kind of authority often to push this through. Now, we can talk a little bit about this a little bit later, because obviously the ideal is that if everyone's looking in in the same direction and contributing, then you don't need to impose any kind of authority. I think really that's a little bit utopian in my experience, particularly in the institutions of the size of my own. We have over 100 faculty. It's just simply impossible just to expect everyone to work together on these things. Excuse me. And that leads us nicely into teacher resistance, which again, as I presume most of you are all administrators, teacher resistance is a real thing, and it's a perfectly normal thing in the sense that, as I've said, often this kind of work is extra to someone's normal job. As administrators, presumably we're teaching a little bit less, but your normal teacher who you're relying on often to implement some of these plans or to take part in the planning process, they're not getting time release. And so these are just on top of what they would already do. And so there's a certain amount of resistance to that. And then, of course, depending on what the management has decided is their priority, there may be a certain amount of resistance to the direction in which you're moving. Ideally, you would get everyone's buy-in, and that's part of the planning process. But of course, you can't keep everyone happy. And so there's always going to be pockets of resistance. And that can be very draining, both on you sort of mentally and in time, trying to sort of force some of these things through. And then again, these all link together really. The time aspect is just, have you got enough time? And I think in reality, one reason many plans fail is that people just cannot allocate enough time, resource to get them done properly. And once it's done, you kind of think, oh, thank God that's done. I don't have to think about it for another year. And of course, that loses the cycle, the quality cycle that I was talking about earlier. And then finally, the idea of measuring success. Now, ideally, you would have come up with some excellent objectives and action plans which incorporate sort of key areas which can be measured. That's a feature, obviously, of a good plan, but still it's difficult sometimes to measure success, particularly in a teaching environment. For example, if you want to literally improve classroom instruction, there are many things you can do, and you can describe objectives to achieving things that you want to achieve, but actually measuring your success in that can be quite challenging. And I think that often leads people to give up because it's just a bit too difficult. So those are the challenges of which I don't think we should underestimate, but at the same time, you can do things about them. Sometimes it's impossible, but most of the time, I think you can get over those. Okay, so here's some sort of just small tips for supporting sustainability, trying to rise to these challenges. And I think the most important one is having a system in writing. And it's impossible to do a proper plan that doesn't have a written element that goes into quite some detail. It sounds obvious, I know, but you'd be amazed at what are some of the things I've seen in very good quality institutions, places where the teaching level is amazing and the faculty are great, but their planning documents are a series of just kind of minutes, maybe, or even literally handwritten notes. And so having a policy and a plan is going to make it much easier for everyone to work through the process. And if nothing else, it helps when there's changes in the administration. So, there's something written down that someone can take up and continue with. The next one, again, very important, this training idea. Now, sessions like this can help. They're not going to change. They're not going to turn people from, novices to expert planners in one 50-minute webinar, but doing stuff like this does definitely help. But also as managers and people with experience of doing planning exercises, the idea of kind of mentoring new managers and training them to, take part in the process is really important. But also not just focusing on the management. If you're going to have a successful plan, it almost certainly involves the buy-in to some extent from the faculty as well. And so training them in these kinds of things is also incredibly important. It doesn't necessarily mean formal qualifications. It can just be working together on things and giving people experience of doing it. The next one is, again, as I presume we're all administrators in some way, we're going to be managing people. And, someone has to lead this. It's just not going to happen organically. It would be lovely if it did, and it would be lovely if everyone in the organization was on the same page and there was this swell from the bottom forcing change. But my experience in this industry and my experience accrediting other sites, this just does not happen. And so someone needs to lead it. And there's just no getting away from that. And, that means it means real leadership rather than management as such. So this is not just ticking boxes or telling people to allocate resources in a different way. You have to kind of inspire and lead this process, and you have to show yourself to be bought into it and thinking it's important and, part of the culture of the institution that you're in. If it's not part of the culture, that's where the sustainability becomes extremely difficult. And then just a quick word on resistance. We can't obviously make everyone happy all the time, but one way in which I can say from my own institution that we've done some things to tackle resistance is actually make the planning and our annual review processes part of everyone's job. So it's in all the job descriptions, even if you're just a faculty teacher, not without any administrative duties, still we've added to the job descriptions something about the planning process. It's in all of our handbooks, and we do a lot of training and leading. We always have representatives from the faculty in our planning meetings. It's very important for us that they take part in that. And as such, I think, fingers crossed, I think we can say that we do have a culture of review in the organization. It's by far from being perfect. And if, for example, I just let it go and just didn't remind anyone and just sort of wondered what would happen, I'm sure in time the planning process would start to fall to bits. But at the same time, we don't have people questioning why are we doing this, and we don't have people just not taking part at all. So we do have, to some extent, a culture of that, of planning and review in our institution, and therefore the resistance has definitely gone down over time. When we first started, it was creating a lot of work, and over time, people have accepted it much more readily. Okay. So let me just stop sharing there. And I'm going to just in the chat box, I'm going to put a an outline of the strategic plan process so you can, okay. Oh, so sorry, I can't do that right now because I've got it open on my desktop. Let me share it and then I will close it and put it in the chat box. So let me just share this document. Just bear with me for 1 second. Yeah, there we go. Hopefully you can see that in a second. Okay, can everyone see that? So again, I will close this shortly. I'm just going to fly through this, but you can have a look at this in your own time. I was going to do a quick exercise where you filled in the gaps, but I thought that would take a very long time and probably not be that useful. So here's what I've put together for you as an overview of the process. So this is very much a kind of global strategic plan for an organization. It's not necessarily focused on fixing individual problems, although that will come out of this if you do this part properly. But you can see I've defined lots of different phases where we talk about, who are the stakeholders, who's going to be in the team, then what work are we going to do to define our mission, vision, and values, assuming that you don't have them, or if you do have them, let's review them and make sure that they're still current. Then there's a lot of situational analysis. So there's internal analysis of our strengths and capacity, external analysis, political, economic, technological, for example, things that may be affecting how we do what we want. And then you'll SWOT and SWOC there. Really looking at the institution or the program in detail. Then looking at our external stakeholders, doing questionnaires of students, of faculty, of, in our case, the faculty departments in our EMI institution, holding focus groups, obviously very good to do, maybe very labor intensive if you not something that you necessarily always can do. And so that's part of the preparation. And then we've got our goal setting and then putting together the actual plans. So, you know, defining them in very measurable ways, establishing our key performance indicators, the metrics that we're going to be used to measure our progress. And then the last part is kind of communicating the plan, getting people's buy-in, and then obviously then going on to the implementation phase. And obviously point 10 there is once you've started implementing, obviously some things are going to go well, some things won't go well, some things will go as you liked, but actually aren't really fit for their purpose. And so you're going to have to tweak them as you're going along, and that's going to involve continual evaluation and some form of annual, or certainly periodic review of what you've done. So let me close that and I will stick that in the chat box for you. So that's just sort of an outline for you to have a look at in your own time. Um, Let me go back to my slideshow. Okay, so what I wanted to do now is, okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Sorry, I need to share my screen again. Okay, now I can't see the chat box. Perhaps this is my inexperience in Zoom, but I've got a plan here, super basic, but just have a look at that and you can write in the chat box or call out any sort of problems that you can see with this very, very basic plan. And I have to confess, I can't see the chat box when I've got my screen like this, but I know maybe I can. Yeah, there you go. I can. So just have a look at that. See, I mean, there are some fairly obvious potential problems with this plan. So does anyone want to, you can write in the chat box or you can call out or you can just say it to yourself and we'll go over them. I'll give you a few minutes. Yeah, so the goal is very vague. Yeah, vague goal and objectives. Yeah. So that's the killer. Like nothing good will happen when you've got, a vague goal and objectives. Now, okay, the goal, improving student speaking skills, you could maybe accept that as the very, very sort of, the overall umbrella goal. But then, at some point, and probably certainly within the objectives, you need to define much more tightly what those objectives are going to be. Because it's just obvious, unless we know exactly what we want to do, there's very little chance that we're actually going to do it. And so because we've got these very vague objectives, it then makes the action steps difficult. And yeah, so again, the action steps are not clear and specific enough. But of course, they're never going to be because the objectives are wrong. And if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this session is how important the objectives are. If you get the objectives right, it doesn't mean you'll definitely be successful, but if you get them wrong, you almost 100% will be unsuccessful. But so yeah, asking students how they feel, for example, or having more meetings about what to do. I mean, I've deliberately written these in a slightly ridiculous way, but you would be surprised at how poorly drafted plans I've seen in my time. And this is not a million miles away from some of the things that I've seen with our strategic plan written on the top. Okay, the other things we could say maybe in the summer is very unspecific. Yeah, and they haven't got milestones. That's a very good point. So this is a difficult thing to do, isn't it? Improving student skills is actually quite difficult. It's difficult to measure too. And so we need to break it up into different milestones so that we can hope to achieve what we want to. So I've just put in red here. Sorry. Yeah, no, I haven't. So let's just go on to a slightly better drafted one. Again, it's not necessarily absolutely perfect, but you can see hopefully at least there's a very clear objective here. So we're talking about improving student retention, and we've got a very clear goal as to what we want to do. Now, of course, retention is quite easy to express, and I deliberately chose it because it's quite easy to express in a clear objective. But nonetheless, I think it is still this allows us to see, the difference between A and B is quite stark. So A, we've got sort of um, do more activities for students, improve classes, and we've got to, increase student course completion rates from 85% to 90%. And there's a very, very easy way to measure that. And so we'll know if we've been successful. And then under the action steps, we've got, again, very, very clear things. We know whether we're doing them or not. And the timeline is a little bit more specific. Obviously, this is very, very simple example. This is not, how I would necessarily advise you to do the plan, because you're going to have way more objectives and slightly more complicated approaches to these things. But it gives you an idea of the kinds of things that you would need to do to make it tightly defined so that it is achievable. Okay, let's move on. Oh, sorry, yeah. So I put in red there the things that I think make this plan much better than the previous one. And at the end there, you can see evaluation. We've actually going to look at how we've done, and we're going to report it, and we're going to look at the data and decide, is what we've decided to do, is it working? And if not, it gives you an opportunity to try and fix that. Okay, I've got an actual activity, and I think, Johnny, could you tell me, have we got time to do this activity or not? I suspect we might not. Is Johnny
Think we
there?
have if it's about 10 minutes.
You think we have if it's 10 minutes? Yeah, I'm just wondering, perhaps you can tell me. I've got two options. I can give you a little task to do in the breakout rooms. I don't know how many people are here, 16. Yeah, we could have a couple of breakout rooms. Or I could show you some examples of plans that I've done this year for the accreditation agency. Which I don't think I've got time to do both of those things. What I will do is, if we don't do the exercise, I will just give you the exercise and you can do that at home. Anyone got any clear preferences for that? I'm starting to doubt that we do really have enough time to do the exercise, which I suspected might be the case. Anyone strongly object to doing the exercise as a take home and me showing you some example plans? No, okay, I'm taking your silence as agreement then. So let me just share you some examples of the plans that I've been working on. And let me first, so as I say, this is an accrediting agency in Turkey, and this is an example of our overall plan, and this is over a 5-year period. And so you can see at the top there, after all the data collection and focus groups and questionnaires and going through all the vision and strategy sort of ideas, we came up with a number of strategic priorities, and you can see at the top there, priority 1, and I'm just sort of highlighting it there. So one of our most important priority was facilitating and promoting the ongoing development of quality in the field through outreach, training, and support. So that's a very, very broad umbrella. That's the point of our accrediting agency. That's why we're doing the accrediting. And then we've got various action steps. And remember, these again are quite broad because they are over a 5-year period. I'm going to show you the yearly plan a little bit later. So our first action step is to continue to develop training and support services for IEPs. Hence, we're going to support our target audience to become accredited by providing training opportunities. And so you can see we've got some success criteria here. So these are all examples. If we get our plan right, if we actually implement our plan correctly, this is what the success will look like. So the first one is, we start to offer quite a broad range of synchronous and asynchronous training topics on behalf of DEDAC. The next one is ELT professionals all over Turkey start to participate in our trainings. and that ELT professionals come to DEDAC about topics related to accreditation. Now, if all of those things happen, they are indicators of success under priority one. And you'll see there are some defined steps here, and these are going to be fleshed out in more detail in our 1 year plan. So you can see it's quite sort of helicopter view. It's quite general. It doesn't have the timelines here because those are going to be put into our 1 year plan. But you can see everything's organized under our strategic priority. So our second strategic priority is leading the field in promoting ESL program quality by acting as a model accrediting agency. And first action step for that is exemplifying model accreditation practice through our own activities. So how we're governed, how we conduct site reviews, how we appear to the outside world, becoming respected, becoming a voice that is listened to. That's all part of this priority. And for example, one of the success criteria for that would be showing in our data that more and more sites are getting 5 year accreditation right from the start without reporting requirements, with far fewer reporting requirements. Okay, so that's I'm very happy to. This is a public document. I won't put it in the chat box, but I'm very happy to share it with anyone who emails me. Let me just stop sharing that, and I'll just quickly share for you the 1 year plan, and again, you'll see that. So this is actually drilling down a little bit more. So you can see we've still got the priority and we've got one of the action steps here. But at this time, we've actually got the actual steps that we're going to take to do these things, and the metrics or the deliverables, how we're going to, what's going to happen once we've done all of these things, who's doing them, and our quite detailed timelines. And then we've got some just general notes here. So you'll see for, this is the year one plan. So under priority one, we've chosen to do just one action step because it's quite a big one. There are, as you probably remember, there are 2 or 3 more action steps under this priority that we'll do in later years. I'll just quickly flick on to the next one. So, priority 2, if you remember, was leading the field in promoting ESL program quality. And the action step was, exemplifying model accreditation progress. And so we are at the moment compiling a protocol for mid self-study check-in. So in other words, while people are doing their self-study, we're going to call in on them halfway through to check how things are going, writing them if they're off if they're off in the wrong direction, answering their questions, also designing scripts for all the site review activities to make sure every site is getting the same thing. And then, there are some typically challenging standards. Planning and review is one of them. And so we're going to be discussing with sites how that they can best meet those standards, not telling them what to do, but explaining what we're looking for and various ways in which they can do that. So again, this is the 1 year plan. You can see it's much more detailed, and it's got the metrics and deliverables, ways in which we're going to measure whether we're successful or not. Okay, I will. Again, if people email me, I'm very happy to share that. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of wrap up very quickly. Let me share my PowerPoint again. And then we'll have some time for questions or discussions. So let me just wrap up with a final slide. Everyone can see that now. So let's just wrap up some of the things I've said. So, this difference between looking forwards and looking backwards. When we're doing strategic planning, we need to not just be evaluating what's happened, we also need to be anticipating, preparing for the future, and we're going to do that with our strategic plan. I was talking about the quality assurance cycle and the link between the quality cycle and planning. And basically, the planning is just how we achieve the quality cycle. It's the tool in which we can do that. And the better we do that, and the more successful our quality cycle will be. I contrasted strategic planning with firefighting. I'm sure this is not new to you, but strategic planning must be by definition intentional and systematic. We're not just reacting to problems. We are facilitating progress, refers back to the quality cycle. So like it or not, we have to do this. And this is the last point. The basic strategic plan is about sweat and tears, I'm afraid. It's not easy. It's easy in the sense that I don't think it's a complicated thing to put together a basic plan. But it is difficult to actually push it through sometimes. But most of that involves hard work. It's something that's not mysterious. It's not something that people can't learn how to do. It's just something that we need the energy with which to just push on through and get these things done. But also that does mean we need to commit resources to it. And I do appreciate that many institutions and programs just really struggle for the resources, and that could be the reason why often planning and strategic review doesn't go well. And when I'm on sites, I'm very sort of cognizant of the fact that sites struggle with this because of resources. But of course, that doesn't mean they meet the standard, and it's an incredibly important discipline to get into. So you need to find a way in which you can make a practical system that is actually sustainable with the resources that you've got. Okay, that's all I had to say. I'm sorry I went quite quickly, but it is a huge topic. I'm just going to put in the chat box the little task that I was going to give you. Please feel free to have a look at that. And I'm very, very happy to review anyone's answers or to answer any questions on that after this. I can put my email address in the chat box here. So I'm always happy to hear from anyone to chat through some of these things, or you can just send me your draft plan on the topic and I can give you some feedback. But apart from that, I don't have anything more to say. So, Johnny, have there been any questions, or does anyone want to say anything?
There haven't been any questions so far, but I can throw one at you if you don't mind.
Okay, I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but yeah, has anyone got any comments maybe, or anyone share some experiences maybe of planning exercises that they've been through that have either worked well or worked badly?
Maybe fairly quiet. If you don't mind, what would be your top tips for generating buy-in among staff when you're trying to drive forward with
Yeah, so
change?
that's a good question. I mean, obviously, it depends how big your institution is. I said mine is over 100 faculty. Um, your language school may be just 20 people. It's much easier, obviously, to get buy-in from 20 people. If you're in a large program, communication probably is more important than getting everyone involved, because it's just not possible to get everyone involved. But everyone should know what you're doing. As I mentioned before, it's part of our culture because we've kind of pushed it into the culture by making it part of our handbooks, by regularly sort of publishing what we're doing. All of our documents are sort of open and available to everyone. We announce what decisions we've been made, what decisions we've made, and we always have different faculty representatives whose job it is to go out and collect data amongst the faculty before our big planning meeting of the year. And I think that does help quite a lot. But of course, you'll never ever get full buy-in, especially when you're making decisions which aren't always that popular with everyone. So again, it's a battle of wills to some extent, and it's doing it in a inclusive way as possible. But I think as I said earlier, the management have to lead with this. It's not just going to happen. Oh, at what point is a handbook too long? That's a very good question. Well, in Turkey, no one likes to read anything. And so ours isn't that long. I think it probably in total, probably about 30 pages, 35 pages, I guess I would think. And that's a summary of pretty much all of our policies. Probably I wouldn't certainly in Turkey, I wouldn't have it much longer than that. It slightly depends on the culture that you've got. But I think the other thing is, if people get used to just getting all their answers from asking people and you answer, then of course they're not going to bother to look in the book. So sometimes you might have to say, oh, well, it's in the faculty handbook. Of course, with AI now, you can have a chat bot effectively answering all of these questions based on your handbook, in which case it doesn't really matter how long the handbook is, I would say, in these days, if you're going to go down the chatbot route, which actually can be done relatively easily now. We've been experimenting. We haven't finalized it yet, but it kind of works fairly well. So I think we'll probably go down that route quite shortly. Any other questions? No. Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's always nice to sort of talk about this topic. It's not an easy topic, but as I said, it doesn't have to be a mysterious one. Although, I've said to you, I visit many, many sites, and it is a big problem for them. It's usually a problem because I think they almost defeat themselves by making it more mysterious than it needs to be and or just not allocating sufficient resources. If you can do that, then usually I think you'll be okay. But I'm always very happy if anyone wants any tips or if they just want to discuss a problem that they're having with their planning process. I'm always very happy to chat with you, not because I know all the answers, but at least I have a good experience of seeing lots of other people's plans, some that work and some that don't. So I can help you with that.
All right. Thank you very much, Ian. That was insightful and yeah, very interesting.
Thank you
Um,
very much.
just on the topic of strategic planning, make sure the LAMSIG PCE is part of your 2026 strategy. We'll be having Sarah Mercer, Beatrice Segura Harvey, and George Pickering presenting. Um, there is an early bird discount until the 14th of January. So for members, it would be £61. And for non-members, it would be £74. And the topic is going to be dealing with change management. Um, so yeah, make sure you sign up for the LAMSIG PCE. I hope you all have a fantastic end to your 2025 and a wonderful start to 2026. Cool. Once again, thank you very much, Ian. Uh, bye bye, everybody.